But why don't you go ahead and define emotional abuse and spiritual abuse?
Okay. Well, I like to start with a generic definition for abuse, and my generic meaning that applies to all abuse, and that is that I see abuse being when one person crosses a boundary, a personal boundary of someone, to take something from them for their benefit at the expense of the other person. So with emotional abuse, I do that. I take something from you. I cross your boundaries emotionally by manipulating you, um, shaming you, uh, intimidating you, gaslighting you, all those things I can do to get something from you emotionally. I'm trying to manipulate you to do what I want you to do. And you feel something's been taken from you. You can feel that, and it hurts. That's where the abuse comes in. Spiritual
I mean,
abuse.
before
Oh,
you
go
move on to
ahead.
spiritual abuse, can I ask
Yeah.
you, when you said you're trying to take something from someone to gain something for yourself,
Right.
um, I when I was walking through my first bout of spiritual abuse, I had a really hard time believing that the person was doing this with evil intent. Like I just couldn't wrap my mind around that. Are
Yeah.
there ever instances that people do things and they don't really know that they're trying to do that? Like they just, or maybe they've got brokenness inside, wounding inside
Yeah.
themselves. And so they do things and there might not be an evil intent there, but it's still manipulation. It's still gaslighting.
Right.
Do you see what I'm trying to ask?
There's probably people who are evil in their intent. They're the sociopaths, and they actually want to inflict pain on others, which is scary to think of, but I think it's out there. I would imagine that most abusers are just, for whatever reason, like you said, they are, it's all about them. And they see things, and maybe if you're a pastor, they see it from a spiritual dimension, like God has called me and God wants me to do this great thing. And, he knows I'm not perfect. So I'm going to make my mistakes and I might hurt a few people here and there, but it's all for the greater good. And so they
Hmm.
can justify it. I don't think they don't get up every morning and say, how can I hurt the people in my church? I would hope that's not true. Um, but I think they are so, they live in a world of mirrors where everything's about them, that they have no empathy. They can't think about how their impact might hurt the other person. They assume, like, oh well, if they're helping me achieve this great thing for God, why wouldn't that make them thrilled, right?
Hmm.
They don't realize that it could be damaging this other person in an abusive, traumatic way.
So go ahead and give us the definition of spiritual abuse then.
So spiritual abuse, I'm sure you're going to get different definitions from different people, but my definition would be the exact same thing as emotional abuse, using the same tactics, intimidation, manipulation, and so forth. But the difference is, and this is what really jacks it up as far as the power that it holds over people, is you justify your abuse with saying, "Well, God told me."
Hmm.
God spoke to me. The Bible says, my interpretation is, and I've got the only right interpretation. So you have to do what I say. So emotional abuse, you might be able to say, well, they're crazy. But when they start saying God told me, it's like, oh, I don't know, maybe they're closer to God than I am. I mean, maybe God really did tell them, and it just throws you into this tizzy because you're not sure. I mean, like I had mentioned to you before we went on air that I heard your story, and it sounded like that happened to you. That you were when your pastor started telling you all these different things, it really threw you in a tailspin because you were a brand new Christian and you didn't really know. And I think that happens a lot.
And it is so disorienting because you cannot, like, that still small voice or that discernment or that gut feeling is telling you, this isn't right, this isn't right, this isn't right. But then you have this spiritual giant in front of you who you
Yeah,
love and trust and has brought you to Jesus and has taught you so much. And you literally think, how can I challenge this person? I've
right.
not been to seminary. I don't know. And that's why it's just so damaging and painful and depressing and makes you so full of anxiety.
Yeah, yep.
In your book, you describe toxic faith and spiritual abuse as categories. And I thought this was brilliant. And you've got this really powerful quote. And you say, toxic faith is the soil from which spiritual abuse grows. Toxic
Yep.
faith is the soil from which spiritual abuse grows. And I just had to be like, hold on, I got to process this. I mean, that is just so good. So, in terms of What's the difference between toxic faith and, spiritual abuse? And the kind of walk us through that.
Yeah, well, I'm very visual, so that just helps. That's I also often think things through from a visual perspective, so it helps me to distinguish the two. Toxic faith being like this soil, so there's something. I don't think they're the same thing, but you can be in a toxic environment, and typically in the church, that means it's legalistic. So you've got rules all over the place. It can be a culture of fear. Typically, a toxic culture is a culture of fear, and that doesn't necessitate abuse, but it's if the seed is in the soil, it's probably going to produce spiritual abuse.
Mm.
So the toxic faith is a culture, and out of that grows actions where people say, because of all these rules, I can now apply them to you and make you feel guilty if you don't live up to the rules that I'm telling you you should follow. So does
So
that distinction help?
yes, absolutely. So you may not be an abusive church if there's toxic faith there, but the soil isn't looking good. And if that soil doesn't get changed and the fear get removed, the legalism doesn't get removed, it's on a bad growth plan, basically.
Right. Yeah, I was reading Scott McKnight's book on the Church of Tove recently, and I think he was quoting someone else, but talking about that a church culture or any culture, if you're in that culture, you will become that culture. You're a product of that culture. So if the culture is toxic, you will become a toxic person because it's going to affect your thinking. You're going to start thinking like the culture thinks. And the scary thing is you don't even know it because it starts small, and over time you just absorb that toxicity. And then you start treating other people the way you've now been treated. And it all starts to seem normal, which is, like I said, scary.